So we are even slimmer than usual this morning. We'll cover everything in the announcements when the worship hour comes around. We've got several that we need to pray for. For now, let us jump into our study. We've been studying through the book of Joshua, and we have come up to chapter 5. I think we left off, probably around verse 8 last week. So we started to see how after the crossing of the Jordan, Israel is being consecrated. And we noticed this at the beginning of that whole arc that starts in chapter 3. Right? It's kind of built in layers. Right? So the center of that is the actual crossing. On the outer layers, both at the beginning of Joshua 3 and now here in Joshua 5, we have Israel being consecrated. And of course, whenever the scriptures repeat something like this, it's usually important. And we're going to see going into chapter 6 that this is especially significant. We're going to see them consecrated in 3 ways, which is also a significant number. Last week we started looking at the circumcision. And this week, Lord willing, we will look at the Passover. We will look at Joshua's meeting with the commander of the Lord's army. And it is my plan to get us into the actual Battle of Jericho in chapter 6. Let's pick up in... Actually, I tell you, before we read the text, one thing I want us to remember, the conquering generation here that is entering into the promised land, so the generation that was born in the wilderness, remember, they have to be they have to be circumcised at this point because their fathers did not circumcise them in the wilderness. The text doesn't tell us why. The text doesn't really give us really much of any kind of judgment about it, although we can see from other places in the scripture that this is a really serious deal, and that the Lord very likely has extended mercy to them, or perhaps has placed the punishment on their fathers. It might just be something that we can add to the list of reasons why the Exodus generation died in the wilderness. Right? It is not just that they refused to enter into the promised land, back in Numbers whenever God told them to, but it is also that they rebelled several times in the wilderness. They worshipped idols in the wilderness. They engaged in sexual immorality in the wilderness, and also failed to circumcise their sons in the wilderness. And it makes us think of that odd story about Moses and Gershom and Zipporah that we read in Exodus chapter 4, where they are traveling on the way back to Egypt, and the Lord attacks. It doesn't really tell us who, if it's Moses or if it's Gershom, just as the Lord attacked him. But the attack takes place because Moses has failed to circumcise Gershom, and Zipporah has to fix that with a flint knife, just as Joshua is doing here in Joshua chapter 5. The Lord commands him to make flint knives and to circumcise the sons of Israel. And we noted that this is possibly the worst possible place that you would expect this kind of thing to happen. Right? If somebody's tempted to say, well, maybe they weren't circumcised in the wilderness because they had to remain battle ready. But where do we think they're at now? They're right outside of Jericho. They are on the western side of the Jordan. They've got the Jordan at their backs. This is the most vulnerable they have been on this entire journey. And it's at this point that the Lord tells them to get circumcised. And it is another signifier of the Lord's faithfulness in protecting them, because he makes them extremely vulnerable here. And it also reminds us of what we read in verse 1. As soon as all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan for the people of Israel until they had crossed over, their hearts melted. There was no longer any spirit in them, because of the people of Israel. All right, the nations are terrified. And again, this goes back to what God has done. All right, so God has terrified the nations. They are not going to come out and attack. And God is protecting Israel, as we read in verse 8, when the circumcising of the whole nation was finished, they remained in their places in the camp until they were healed. All right, and again, we recognize what a dangerous position this was for them. We remember the story in Genesis 34 of Reuben and Levi, or no, I think it was Levi and Simeon, rather, fooling the men of Shechem into getting circumcised so that they could marry their sister Dinah. And it was at that point, while they were healing up, while they were sore from the surgery, that Simeon and Levi led a band of men to attack the city and kill all of them. Right? So with that in our minds, we read a verse like this and we think Israel is in danger. And yet nothing happens to them because the Lord is protecting them. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." And so the name of that place is called Gilgal to this day. As we've gone along in this narrative, we've noted just how things unroll kind of slowly. We will get details, and then those details are expanded on or explained later on. We have heard the name Gilgal before. We know that Israel is encamping at Gilgal, but it is only now that we get an explanation for the name. The name of the place, Gilgal, sounds like the Hebrew word meaning to roll. The place is called that because the Lord is rolling away the reproach of Egypt from Israel. What precisely that means, we're not sure. It's a matter of some debate, whether we're talking about the scorn that Israel would have borne from their masters in Egypt, and now the Lord is vindicating Israel by giving them the conquest. That's an option. Perhaps that's the reproach of Egypt that is being rolled away from them. Another option is, because it's tied specifically to the circumcision, it could be a recognition that the Egyptian generation, the Exodus generation, sinned in not circumcising their sons, and the wilderness generation has been unclean their entire lives, and now God is fixing that by having Joshua circumcise them, and in that way, the reproach of Egypt is being rolled away. Whatever this phrase means, it does signify that God is establishing Israel in a special way. He is fulfilling his promises to them as they are entering into the promised land. Excuse me. It signifies a break with the old and the beginning of something new in Israel. I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time on the circumcision since we had talked about it a little bit last week. Any questions or comments about the circumcision before we go to the Passover? Okay, verse 10. While the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month on the evening on the plains of Jericho. And the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. And the manna ceased the day after they ate of the produce of the land. And there was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. The Passover bookends the Exodus experience in a couple of different ways. It obviously points us back to the very first Passover, as Israel is escaping from Egypt and being vindicated over and against Egypt. They keep the Passover. And now here at this end of things, they're keeping the Passover again, and again we find this keeping of the meal associated with Israel being vindicated against their enemies, because the land of Canaan is about to receive the Lord's punishment for their wickedness. It also ties us back to the second Passover that we saw. And in fact, in that way, it also acts as kind of a bookend. Depends on where you want to put the bookends. Because the last time that we saw Israel keep the Passover was when the Egyptian generation departed Mount Sinai. So they had just received the law. They had just built the Ark of the Covenant. And so the keeping of that Passover marked the occasion where the Lord represented, his presence being represented by the Ark of the Covenant, marched forward from Mount Sinai towards this conquest in the Promised Land. And now, as they celebrate this other Passover, the presence of the Lord, the Ark of the Covenant, has gone into the Promised Land and is about to accomplish a great victory for Israel. Now, here's something interesting, and this was, I puzzled over this for a while. Because, we've just learned that all of these guys, their entire lives up to this point, had not been circumcised, and then they keep the Passover. Now, think back to Exodus 12, when the Passover was instituted. What are the rules for keeping the Passover? What state do you have to be in as an Israelite male to keep the Passover? What's the law require? You have to be circumcised. And so that begs the question, have these guys ever kept the Passover? Because they've not been circumcised. And that got me to digging, that got me to thinking. The last time that we saw Israel keep the Passover was at Mount Sinai. Right? That was the Exodus generation. That was before they had refused to enter the Promised Land. Right? At that point, back in Exodus chapter 9, chapter 10, they were still slated to be on the receiving end of these promises. They were going to be the ones to go into the Promised Land and conquer. Right? And they were all circumcised, so they obviously could keep the Passover. That is the last time that we see them keep the meal. Now, we can't make any assumptions about it one way or the other, but we never see it recorded in Scripture where they keep the Passover as they are wandering in the wilderness. John?
So you're saying 30-plus years where
There's a strong possibility of that, especially for this generation that was born in the wilderness. They at least are supposed to be excluded from taking the Passover because they're not circumcised. And so very likely this is their first Passover as they are entering into the Promised Land. So these guys who have been wandering around their whole lives in the wilderness, who were born and raised in the wilderness, they are just now fully becoming Israel. Their fathers botched things that badly.
The significance of the Passover meal that they're eating is now they're eating what God promised them, the milk and honey.
Exactly.
The land. So that's what the significance of the manna being gone and them eating of the fruit of the land, correct?
Exactly, yes. That God is fulfilling his promises to them. In fact, notice it's an interesting association here, because what do you expect to see them eating with the Passover? You see the unleavened bread, but you also see the lamb, right? And here the focus, this is not saying that they didn't eat a lamb. The text is not focused on the lamb. The text is focused on the produce of the land, these unleavened cakes and parched grain. So after they eat the Passover meal, in fact, the text tells us the day after they ate the Passover, on that day, that's when they begin to eat the produce of the land. And again, there's this break between old and new, just like we saw with the first Passover. Right? The first Passover was a turning point in Israel's status and in their history. Before the Passover, they had been Pharaoh's slaves. Pharaoh would not let them go. They were abused and mistreated by Egypt. And after the Passover, They are free. And in fact, we remember at around that time they had found the favor of the Egyptian people, and the Egyptians had given up all of their goods to them, all of this gold and silver. And Israel is a new people. They are experiencing the promises of God, and that turning point is at the Passover. Rena, I saw your hand.
I was going to ask what the manna was from.
It's described as something like coriander. So some kind of flaky white powder.
What is coriander?
It's a very small seed. So it would have been something like a very fine white powder. And again, it's hard to describe mainly because they didn't know what it was. And that's the point of the name manna, is what is this? That's the significance of the name. What am I looking at here?
Have you ever ate it?
Because whatever the manna was, it was divine in nature, right? I mean, it was miraculous in nature, provided by God, not some kind of natural food. It was, if I remember, they were capable of making some kind of bread out of it, but it tasted like honey. I mean, it was just a really odd food. And they were sustained on that for the entire generation that they were wandering in the wilderness. And it's at this point, now that they have entered into the promised land, that they begin to enjoy the fruits of the promised land. So, excellent. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything from my notes here.
What did you say the manna means? The word manna means?
It means something like what. It's a play off the Hebrew word for what. Essentially, I have no idea what this is. All right, any other questions or comments about the Passover that they keep here? Okay, let's continue on to verse 13. And we are going to see the third consecration narrative. Oh, yes. Yeah, that's, as far as we know, we're not told otherwise. Yes, so they, what we read about it in, I forget what chapter of Exodus where the manna begins. But the procedure is the Lord provides it for them every day. They are to go out every day and collect, I think it was an omer of manna. And they were to, any that they were going to eat, they were to prepare and eat that day, because if they kept any over, it would spoil. And what we learn about it is that some of them went out and collected more than they were supposed to. And when they came back, it turned out that they had exactly as much as they were supposed to have. Some people went out and collected less than they were supposed to. They came back and found the same. They ended up with exactly as much as they were supposed to have. And any of them that tried to keep it over, it spoiled, basically produced worms like immediately. And over the Sabbath, they were to take a double portion, and because they weren't to go out and do any work on the Sabbath, and it was only over the Sabbath that they could keep any over without it spoiling. So, short history of the manna. That is, by the way, just kind of keep that in the back of your mind if you've been following along with our sermon series on YouTube on 2 Corinthians. That detail about the manna, that whoever collected much, didn't have any surplus, whoever collected little had no lack, that detail is going to become important in our study of 2 Corinthians later on in the letter. Paul does something interesting with that. So just hold on to that detail. So we'll have some extremely delayed gratification on that. All right, good questions and comments. Verse 13, the commander of the Lord's army. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And he said, "No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so. All right, this is a really bizarre episode because first off, all of a sudden, we have been, and this is just the way stories work, but we have been transported to Jericho. We are no longer at Gilgal, which is, I think, something like 25 miles away. I forget how many miles it is. I mean, the two places are within striking distance of each other, but there's still some distance between them. All of a sudden, Joshua is at Jericho. The ESV renders this by Jericho. There's a lot of different ways to read this, and it is intended to be, he is really right at Jericho. In fact, some interpreters see this as he actually sees the angel of the Lord basically over Jericho. So he's right there next to it, somehow. Probably scouting the place out. We're not told. Because the important detail is he looks up and all of a sudden there's this guy with his sword out. And I don't know if you've ever just randomly encountered somebody on the road looking at you with their sword out. But Joshua asks the natural question, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" In other words, what are your intentions with that sword? And this man says, "No." Right, not exactly the straight answer that Joshua is looking for. "But I am a commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." Now notice we don't really get any detail here. Like, we don't get any follow-up on this. Right, the commander of the Lord's army tells Joshua to take his sandals off because he's on holy ground. Right, Joshua has fallen down on his face in worship. And what we might expect at this point is some kind of ensuing conversation. The commander of the Lord giving Joshua instructions. But nothing comes after this. And I suspect what's going on is that the text is inviting us to make some connections here. Not to speculate, but to connect this back to things that we are already familiar with. Right? So there are some pretty obvious parallels from what we've already read in Scripture to what's happening here. So, for example, when the commander of the Lord's army says to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy," what does that instantly remind us of? Yeah, Mount Horeb, the burning bush. Moses is wandering along and he looks up and he sees this bush that's on fire and not burning up. Oh, that's curious. I'll go check that out. And the Lord tells him precisely what the commander of the Lord's army has told Joshua. "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." All right, we've got some other encounters that we could possibly have in mind. In fact, our first impression of this, all right, we've seen our last impression, that this is meant to make us think back to Moses at the burning bush, a commissioning story where the Lord explains his intentions to Moses and gives Moses his special commission to go and do the work that he set him to. But what's our first impression of this guy? All right, let's go back to the beginning of the passage. Joshua was by Jericho. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. There's been like one other time in the law of Moses, at least, that we have seen this kind of image. Who else has come across a man with his drawn sword in his hand standing in the way? Give you a hint, it involves a special donkey. Balaam. Balaam, as he's riding along, preparing to curse Israel, meets a man, an angel of the Lord, whom he can't see, standing in the road with his drawn sword in his hand. The donkey can see him, but Balaam, blinded by his greed, can't see him. And so the donkey saves him. Our first impression, again, is to think, oh, this is kind of threatening. What's going on here? But then it immediately turns to something positive. The comparison shifts away from Balaam and to Moses. This might also hearken us back to an even earlier encounter, just as bizarre. You'll remember back in Genesis, I should have written down the chapter number. Perhaps 31, where Jacob, remember, meets a stranger and wrestles with this stranger all through the night. And it turns out to be perhaps the Lord, perhaps an angel of the Lord, and we get something similar to the Moses story. It is a commission of sorts that's bound up in the name change from Jacob to Israel. But now Joshua has entered into this register of important leaders of the nation of Israel who have had an encounter with the Lord, or an encounter with the angel of the Lord. No, go ahead.
So this man that he's seeing looks like an angel.
Yes, most likely. So.
He lifted his eyes up to heaven. You would think that he was looking up to heaven.
Yeah, so he looks up.
And this man is in his way on the path with the sword drawn.
Mm-hmm.
And the significance for me, whenever it says take your shoes off, you're not looking. That's you mean you're in the presence of the Lord.
That's it exactly.
You're in God's presence. So now, is it the Lord in God's scripture? They use, I think it's the Lord of hosts to signify God's army. Is that correct?
Yes.
So this is basically going to be the commander of the Lord of hosts, which is going to help Joshua defeat Jericho.
Yes, and in fact, let me look this up real quick since you have mentioned that. So the word for hosts is one that we use in some of our hymns, Sabaoth. So when we read the Lord of hosts, usually it renders something like Adonai Sabaoth. I want to say that that word is used here. It might not be, though. Yeah, it is used here. Yeah, the commander of the army of the Lord. What's rendered army in English there is the Hebrew word tzavah, which is the same as what we would read in Lord of Hosts. So this is the commander of the Lord's hosts that we are looking at here. And his presence here signifies Joshua's victory, the Lord's presence with Joshua for victory, not just at Jericho, but for the entire conquest sequence to come. Right? Because that's what we're about to launch into here. The very next thing we're going to see is the fall of Jericho, and that is going to open up a whole new section in the book. Any questions or comments about this meeting with the commander of the Lord's army? All right, I tell you what, we've only got about 5 minutes before we want to head out and let things clear out for the worship assembly at 11. Let's finish by doing some messianic reading. So this is something that we've, at least since our study in Hebrews, have been trying to do more consciously in our reading of the Old Testament. Right, the text of the Hebrew Scriptures not only tells us about Israel, about what God did historically to Israel and through Israel, but is also a story about God's Messiah and how God is preparing to bring in his Messiah and accomplish his salvation through his Messiah. And what we have seen over the course of this entire narrative, where Israel comes up to the Jordan and crosses it, gets over to the other side, and is consecrated and prepared for what's going to happen in the Promised Land, we have essentially had the entire gospel foreshadowed in this section that we have just finished studying. We need to begin first off with the place where this happens. Right, there is some New Testament significance to this place. Not just specifically Gilgal, but the River Jordan. Right, what's significant about the River Jordan in the New Testament? Jesus is baptized there. By whom, obviously? John the Baptist. This is where, and notice the connection here. In the New Testament, the River Jordan is where the whole operation of the gospel commences. Right? John is doing his ministry, preparing for the coming kingdom. He's declaring the kingdom that Jesus is ushering in. And we see the beginning of that kingdom coming in as Jesus goes to the River Jordan and is baptized by John in the Jordan. That's all foreshadowed here. Because what's happening here at the Jordan is that we're seeing the first taste of God's earthly kingdom, Israel, being established in the land. Right? They're crossing over. They've been circumcised. I almost said sacrificed again. I don't know what's got in my head. They've been circumcised. They have kept the Passover. They have enjoyed the fruits of the land. They are, the kingdom of Israel is not established yet, but it has been announced, it has been declared, and we have seen the beginnings of it here at the River Jordan. And this all foreshadows what happens. In fact, even the crossing itself foreshadows the baptisms that take place at the River Jordan. There are other connections we could make, such as the circumcision of Israel foreshadowing the baptism of the church. The keeping of Passover, foreshadows the crucifixion. So remember the significance of the timing of the crucifixion. The crucifixion happens on Passover, or at least the day before. Right? Jesus would have been crucified as the Passover lamb is being slaughtered in Israel. And here at the River Jordan, they are keeping the Passover. We read about a stone memorial that is set up over the course of chapters 3 and 4. This stone memorial, I think in some important ways, is a foreshadowing of the memorial that we keep today, the Lord's Supper. First off, obviously, by being a memorial. So think about what memorials do, what they are for. We've talked about the connection in this language between the stone memorial and the keeping of the Passover. Right? When your children ask you, why are we eating this meal? What's the meaning of this meal? Or when your children ask you in days to come, what are all these rocks about? You are to tell them, and then it's just the story of God's salvation, that he saved the firstborn of Israel from the plague, that he saved them from Egypt, that he guided them through the wilderness, that he led them across the Jordan into the Promised Land. The same thing is true, ultimately, of the Lord's Supper. I don't know if you've... it is something, I'm glad that I'm in this particular season of life right now because I get to enjoy things like having little kids ask, what are we doing? When we're taking the Lord's Supper, why are we doing this? We've been doing that for several years now because memorials implicate future generations in the events of the past. That is the point of a memorial. Right, so the stones were a way for future generations of Israel to identify with the conquering generation, to recognize the direct link between themselves and the conquering generation, that they are on the receiving end of the same promises. Right, so these stones that they're looking at, these are the very stones that their fathers took from the river. God did this for their fathers, which means he also did it for them. Right, the Lord's Supper likewise does the same thing. Right, when the Lord tells us, those who, if you want eternal life, you've got to eat my flesh and drink my blood. Right, and here at the Lord's table, we've got the flesh and blood that we can point to. It ties us, and when we're taking the Lord's Supper, not only does it tie us to all faithful Christians in the present, but it also ties us back to every Christian who has ever been and to every Christian who ever will be. Because we're all connected through the keeping of this memorial. Right? And when we look at the memorial, it signifies, it reminds us of what God did for the generations before us. Right? 2,000 years ago, God sent his Son to live among men. But what God did for our fathers, he also did for us. And we are reminded of that as we take the supper. Okay. Well, we have exhausted our time this morning. We need to go ahead and step outside and get some fresh air and let some fresh air circulate in here so that we can be ready for the worship hour at 11. Thank you so much for your kind attention and your questions and comments this morning.